May 8th, 1945. Germany has surrendered. Church bells ring across Europe. The world breathes again. But in the scattered corners of the earth, deep in the Arctic, lost in tropical jungles, and stranded on forgotten islands, tens of thousands of German soldiers never got the message. Some refused to believe it, some never heard it, and some simply chose to keep fighting, trapped in a war that no longer existed. This is their story, the war that wouldn't end, and the last Germans who refused to surrender. Chapter 1. The Surrender. That wasn't tea. For most of Europe, the war ended with radio broadcasts and white flags. But for many German units, communication lines had long since collapsed. In Norway, Denmark, Czechoslovakia, and the Baltics, entire divisions were still under arms, unaware that Berlin had fallen. When Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz announced Germany's unconditional surrender from Flensburg, his words echoed across the shortwave network, but much of the German military infrastructure was already destroyed. Deep inside Norway's frozen fjords, 350,000 German troops were still dug in the largest concentration of Axis soldiers left outside Germany itself. They had food, ammunition, and orders to defend the coast until the end. For them, Hitler's Arctic fortress was still very real. On May 9th, when British forces landed to accept their surrender, many German officers refused to believe it. Some demanded to see written proof that the Führer was dead. Others believed it was Allied propaganda designed to lure them into capture. It took days, sometimes weeks, for the truth to reach the farthest outposts. Even then, surrender didn't always mean peace. In Czechoslovakia, German units tried to fight their way west to surrender to the Americans instead of the Soviets. They clashed with Red Army forces and Czech partisans for days after Germany had officially capitulated. Entire towns burned after the war was over. In Latvia and Estonia, small pockets of Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht soldiers vanished into the forests, continuing guerrilla warfare under the banner of anti-Soviet resistance. They called themselves the Forest Brothers. For some, the war wouldn't end until the 1950s. And far to the east, beyond all supply lines, beyond radio contact, a few German submarines were still prowling the oceans, unaware that their nation no longer existed. U-boat commanders had been trained to obey only direct orders from headquarters in Flensburg. When that signal fell silent, they were left adrift in a moral and strategic vacuum. One such submarine, U-977, left Norway in early May 1945 with 46 crewmen on board. Its captain, Heinz Schäfer, had received word of Hitler's death, but not the surrender. Believing the war might continue in secret, he ordered his crew to dive and head south to Argentina. For 66 days, they remained submerged, surfacing only at night for air. It became one of the longest underwater voyages in history. By the time U-977 reached Buenos Aires in August 1945, the war had been over for 3 months. When Argentine authorities handed the crew over to the U.S. Navy, the sailors were stunned. They had fought, suffered, and endured for a war that no longer existed. All over the world, similar stories emerged: German weather stations in the Arctic, outposts in the Aegean, units trapped in Eastern Europe, each living ghosts of a vanished Reich. For these men, surrender was a moment. It was a slow, painful realization that everything they believed in had vanished. Chapter 2. The Ghosts of the Arctic. In the far north, where the sea freezes solid and the sky never truly darkens, World War II didn't end with radio broadcasts or parades. It ended in silence and confusion. By 1945, Germany had built a network of Arctic weather stations stretching from Norway to Greenland. They were essential for the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine, predicting storms that shaped entire battles. Without them, the Atlantic U-boats were blind. One of these stations, Haudegen, was manned by just 11 German soldiers and scientists. They had been sent to the island of Spitsbergen in September 1944, far beyond the Arctic Circle, a frozen wasteland of glaciers, wolves, and endless night. Their mission: gather weather data for a war that was already collapsing. When the Third Reich surrendered in May 1945, no one remembered they were still up there. Their radios fell silent. Their supply submarine never came back. For months, they continued to record weather readings and send coded transmissions to a command that no longer existed. It wasn't until September 1945, 4 months after the war ended, that the small crew finally realized they were alone. Their fuel was running low, food supplies were almost gone, and the Arctic winter was closing in again. The officer in command, Lieutenant Wilhelm Deeg, faced an impossible choice: stay and die in silence, or surrender to whoever might come. They waited for rescue that never came. Finally, Deeg decided to act. He loaded a flare gun, climbed to a frozen ridge, and fired a bright red signal into the fog. 2 days later, a Norwegian seal hunting vessel appeared on the horizon. The crew, stunned, found 11 starving Germans standing in the snow, saluting formally, as if still expecting orders. They handed over their weapons, their coded notebooks, and one final message: Station Haudegen reporting. We await further instructions from Germany. The Norwegian captain reportedly replied, Germany no longer exists. It was September 4th, 1945, almost 4 months after the war had ended. The men of Station Haudegen became the last officially documented German unit to surrender. But they weren't the only ones still fighting the elements. Across the Arctic, other remnants of the German war machine clung to survival. On Jan Mayen Island, another weather team vanished in 1944 and was never heard from again. In Greenland, U.S. patrols found half-frozen camps, abandoned, with coffee still warm in the mugs and logbooks open to the last entries. Visibility poor, temperature -22, awaiting orders. And deep beneath the waves, the Arctic waters hid more secrets. Several U-boats, fleeing surrender orders, tried to escape to South America. Some were sunk by Allied patrols, others simply disappeared. Even decades later, fishermen and Arctic explorers discovered wrecks, steel ghosts, resting under sheets of ice, engines silent, flags still intact. In the decades that followed, the Arctic became a graveyard of forgotten missions. Historians would later call them the last whispers of the Reich. Their purpose had long since vanished, but the men had followed their duty to the end because that was all they knew. In the end, the Arctic didn't kill them with bullets. It killed them with silence. Chapter 3: The Jungle That Wouldn't Surrender. While the Arctic froze the last remnants of the Reich in silence, the jungles of the Pacific did the opposite. They swallowed them whole. Thousands of Axis soldiers, Germans serving as advisors to Japan, U-boat crews, or stranded merchants, vanished into the vastness of Asia. For them, surrender was unthinkable. Some never even knew the war had ended. Others simply refused to believe it. In Southeast Asia, the news of Germany's collapse arrived slowly, distorted by rumor and disbelief. On islands controlled by Japan, German officers had long worked as liaison agents, helping coordinate the exchange of weapons, fuel, and technology between the two Axis powers. When Tokyo fell in 1945, these men faced a terrifying question: what now? For some, the answer was to fight on. On the remote Indonesian island of Java, a small group of German naval engineers refused to surrender. They had been helping the Japanese Navy build miniature submarines and torpedoes. When the emperor announced Japan's surrender in August, they destroyed their blueprints, buried their weapons, and disappeared into the jungle with local collaborators. Months later, Allied patrols would find their camp a few rusted helmets, a broken typewriter, and a logbook still recording radio frequencies as if the war were ongoing. Even stranger stories emerged from Burma and Thailand, where German agents had been training Japanese pilots and advising local governments. After the surrender, some took on new identities, working as mechanics or traders in small towns. It wasn't until years later in the early 1950s that Allied investigators traced their origins. By then, many had married, learned local languages, and built new lives, their uniforms long buried under layers of tropical soil and secrecy. But the most haunting tales came from the Pacific Islands, where time stood still and reality blurred. In 1945, 2 German sailors from U-183 were stranded on the island of Sumatra after their submarine was sunk. With no radio and no way home, they assumed the war continued. They lived off coconuts, built shelters from bamboo, and occasionally clashed with local militias who mistook them for Japanese. When finally discovered by British patrols in 1947, they were barefoot, bearded, and still saluting the Reich. One of them asked if Berlin had been liberated yet. Even into the 1950s, reports surfaced of white men in German uniforms living deep in Indonesian jungles. Most were probably deserters, smugglers, or local mercenaries, but the legend of the last Germans in the jungle became part of wartime folklore. It is easy to forget that in 1945, communication wasn't instant. There were no satellites, no global radio networks linking every soldier to headquarters. When the world moved on, these men didn't. They were trapped in a moment that never ended. To them, surrender wasn't just unthinkable, it was impossible. They had been raised to believe the Reich would last 1,000 years. To wake up one morning and learn that it was gone, erased in a single broadcast, was a reality too vast to comprehend. So they clung to duty, to discipline, to the illusion that somewhere their homeland still stood, and that one day someone would come to bring them home. For some, that day never came. The jungle claimed them, just as the Arctic had claimed the others. Chapter 4. The Men Who Never Came Home. For millions of families across Germany, the war didn't end in May 1945. It ended in silence, a letter that never arrived, a name that never returned. When the guns fell quiet, an estimated 11 million German soldiers were still scattered across Europe, Asia, and the Atlantic. Half of them were in Allied hands, but for hundreds of thousands, especially those captured by the Soviets, their fate would remain unknown for decades. In the East, the surrender didn't mean mercy. To the Red Army, vengeance had only just begun. Entire German divisions cut off in the Baltics, Poland, and the ruins of Stalingrad were marched eastward in endless columns. Many never made it. The Soviet Union called them trophy labor. Men were sent to rebuild what their bombs had destroyed: factories, railways, entire cities. For years after the war, German prisoners worked in Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, cutting timber, digging canals, mining coal. Some adapted, others simply vanished into the snow. In 1947, a Red Cross report estimated that 1.5 million German POWs were still unaccounted for. Rumors spread through post-war Germany. They alive. They'll come home. Mothers kept their sons' rooms untouched. Wives wrote letters that would never be answered. In small villages, women gathered around the radio every night, listening for names read by the new Deutsche Suchdienst, the missing persons service. Each night, thousands of names were spoken, one after another, a slow river of memory that seemed to have no end. But some men did return years later, changed beyond recognition. One of them was Heinrich Gerlach, a former officer captured at Stalingrad. He spent 8 years in Soviet captivity, watching men die of hunger, cold, and exhaustion. When he finally came home in 1953, he described it simply: "We returned to a country that no longer knew us. Others weren't so lucky." In the Siberian camps, winters fell to 40 C. Wooden barracks offered little protection, and food was scarce. Many prisoners resorted to eating bark, rats, or snow. They called themselves the living dead. Some found faith in survival itself. They built churches from scavenged wood, carved crosses from bones, and swore that if they ever saw home again, they would never forget the men who didn't. When West Germany was founded in 1949, one of its first political priorities was the return of its missing soldiers. For years, negotiations continued with Moscow, but the truth was brutal. Many would never come back. By 1955, 10 years after the war, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer finally secured the release of the last major group of POWs from the Soviet Union. They arrived by train, thin, pale, and silent, stepping onto platforms lined with crying families and black and white cameras. Some had spent a decade behind barbed wire. For them, peace felt unreal. They had lived in another world, one of cold, labor, and memory, and now found themselves strangers in their own homeland. But even that wasn't the end. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, occasional reports surfaced of lost Germans still living in Siberia, men who had married, settled, or simply chosen not to return. To them, Germany was a ghost. Others were never found at all. Their names still appear in dusty ledgers, their graves unmarked beneath Russian soil, their stories swallowed by history. The war had taken their youth, their freedom, and for many, their very identity. For them, surrender was not a day in May 1945. It was a lifetime of waiting for a train that would never come. Chapter 5. The Last Surrenders, 1947-1974. By 1947, the world had rebuilt enough to move on. Europe was divided. The Marshall Plan had begun. To most people, World War II was history. But for a handful of men, the war had never truly ended. They were still out there in the mountains, in the jungles, in the ice, hiding, waiting, surviving. The war had given them purpose. Peace had taken it away. In Norway, 2 years after Germany's official surrender, Allied patrols found a tiny German outpost high in the Lingen Alps. 4 men still wearing their Arctic uniforms, guarding a radio post. They had refused to believe reports of Germany's defeat, assuming they were Allied lies meant to demoralize them. When the Norwegians approached, the men raised their rifles then, hesitating, lowered them. One of them reportedly said, "If this is true, then we have been ghosts for 2 years." Further east, in the wreckage of Yugoslavia, a different kind of war continued. Scattered remnants of German and Croatian units fled into the mountains after 1945, hunted by Tito's partisans. Many never surrendered. For years, farmers told stories of foreign soldiers living in caves, stealing food, and vanishing into the woods at night. When a cave network was uncovered near Sarajevo in 1951, investigators found rusted German helmets, Mauser rifles, and a diary dated 1948. Its last entry read, "Still waiting for rescue. The Reich will return." It never did. But the strangest story came from the South Atlantic, aboard a German U-boat that refused to die. In May 1945, U-530 escaped Norway just days after the surrender. Her captain, Otto Vermuth, refused to surrender his ship to the Allies. He ordered his crew to destroy all documents and head for Argentina. They arrived in Mar del Plata 2 months later, claiming they had no idea the war was over. Argentina authorities didn't believe them. For weeks, newspapers ran wild with rumors that they had smuggled Nazi leaders to South America or even brought secret cargo. The truth was more tragic. They were simply running from defeat. Men too proud or too afraid to face the world they'd lost. Another submarine, U-977, made an even longer voyage, 66 days underwater, before surrendering in August 1945. For decades, conspiracy theories swirled that these boats had escaped to Antarctica, but the reality was simpler and sadder. They were sailors without a home, adrift between the war they remembered and the peace they didn't understand. The final chapter of this story unfolded not in Europe or the Arctic, but in the Philippines, nearly 30 years later. When American forces recaptured the islands in 1945, they captured dozens of Japanese soldiers, but also a few Germans who had served as pilots, technicians, or advisors within Japanese units. Most were repatriated after the war, but some vanished. In 1974, when Japanese soldier Hiru Onoda was discovered still fighting in the jungle of Lubang Island, his discovery reignited rumors that a handful of European Axis soldiers might still be out there, living as recluses or mercenaries. Locals spoke of a white-haired man who lived deep in the forest, speaking broken Japanese and wearing an old German pistol. No one ever found proof. But the legend persisted that somewhere, a forgotten soldier still believed the Reich endured. For those who survived, surrender came slowly, not just on paper, but in the heart. To admit defeat was to admit everything they'd fought for had been a lie. That is not an order you can simply obey. It's a truth that breaks you. In 1955, when the last major German prisoners returned from Siberia, West German newspapers declared it the final return. But even then, a few small groups were still missing on Arctic islands, in Balkan forests, and Pacific atolls. Some were eventually found. Others never were. By the time the last official German soldier, Lieutenant Wilhelm Dega of Weather Station Haudegen, surrendered in 1945, the war had technically been over for 120 days. But for many, it would echo through the next 30 years in dreams, in memories, in ghosts. And in that way, the war never really ended. It simply faded slowly, quietly into the minds of men who couldn't let it go. Epilogue. The war that wouldn't die. By the 1970s, most of the world had moved on. The cities were rebuilt. New wars had begun. The grandchildren of soldiers were driving cars, watching television, listening to rock music. But for a few, the war never ended because it had become part of who they were. Some of them had returned home decades earlier, but home no longer felt like home. They were greeted by families who had aged without them, by cities that no longer bore the scars they remembered. The world had changed. They hadn't to. In quiet villages across Germany, old men sat in silence at the edge of their gardens, watching the evening sky as if waiting for something, a sound, a signal, an order that would never come. For them, surrender hadn't been signed in Reims or Berlin. It had been carved slowly, year after year, into the human soul. The war had ended in 1945, but its echoes rippled through time in the rusted wrecks still scattered across Norway's fjords, in the lonely graves of Siberia, and in the jungles where vines grew over helmets no one ever claimed. Everywhere you looked, the ghosts of that war still lingered. In the Arctic, the bones of soldiers still sleep beneath permafrost, their steel helmets frozen into the ground. In the South Atlantic, U-boats lie on the seabed like steel coffins, their hulls perfectly preserved by cold and pressure. And in faraway forests, relic hunters still unearth dog tags, each one a name, a fragment of a story that once had meaning. But perhaps the most haunting relics aren't made of steel or bone. They are memories, letters that were never sent, photographs found in pockets. The quiet knowledge that some men never came home, not because they were killed, but because the war had taken something inside them that peace could never restore. History books often close neatly. War begins, war ends. But real history doesn't work that way. Wars don't end, they fade. They dissolve into decades, into silence, into the faces of those who remember. In 1983, Norwegian explorers revisited the ruins of weather station Haudigen on Spitsbergen. Inside, they found everything preserved exactly as it had been left, logbooks open, bunks made, boots lined neatly by the wall. A small note pinned to a door read, "We waited for you." That single sentence, written by soldiers stranded at the edge of the world, summed up the tragedy of a generation that never truly escaped 1945. The war that began with fire ended with whispers. It consumed continents and empires, then shrank to the memories of a few old men staring at a sunset. And yet, it never fully died. Because every time a historian opens an old diary, every time a diver descends to a forgotten wreck, every time a grandson asks, "What happened to great-grandfather?" the war breathes again, quietly, patiently in remembrance. The last Germans to surrender weren't just men refusing to accept defeat. They were symbols of something larger. How belief can outlast truth, how duty can outlive the cause, and how even in the silence of peace, the echoes of war can still be heard. Stay healthy. Subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and see you in the next one. And if you have an idea for another untold story, share it in the comments. Your voice helps keep their memory alive.